welcome to the Duquesne Philosophy Speaker Series. This is the first installment of our 5 talks this semester, and the full list of the talks is available on the website, so I won't read them all out to you. But we're very lucky to have here today Justin Smith, who is going to speak to us about world philosophy, particularly is Western philosophy a 19th century invention, and not coincidentally, I think he's coming via Australia, New York, Montreal, on his way to Paris. He's just sort of descended and come and talk to us in Pittsburgh, and he's going to reascend to the world level. He got a start in philosophy, at least his doctoral start at Columbia University, where he did his degree, and he spent a year at the Humboldt, a year at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He went through the ranks at Concordia, became full professor, and then moved to Paris, where he's now university professor at the University of Paris Diderot. He has published far too much for me to even summarize, dozens of articles, edited volumes, and so on. I will say the titles of his most recent books. So in 2011, he published with Princeton Divine Machines, Leibniz, and the Sciences of Life. This last summer, if I'm not mistaken, he published Nature, and Human Difference, Race in Early Modern Philosophy. And he's now at work on a global history of philosophy to 1750. So there's an ambitious book, which wouldn't make a good dissertation topic, but we'll no doubt get a taste of some of it from his talk. I'll just also say that he's published a lot in online in popular media as well. So just Google his name and The Stone, and I think he's written about 10 things or so for The Stone. All philosophically rich, as well as accessible to the wider public. Also the Chronicle of Education and Harper's. And finally, I'll mention that I know him through Facebook. That's how we met, and that's where we did all of our correspondence. That's where he accepted the invitation. So don't dismiss Facebook. Good things can come out of it. All right, so please join me in welcoming Justin Smith.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to see such a big crowd. Now, as I often do, I think I'll start by explaining a little bit about the origins of the talk I'm giving before I move to the talk proper. It is a sort of hybrid of a few different projects, one of which Patrick already mentioned, which is this Global History of Philosophy to 1750, which indeed sounds like the most ambitious and ridiculous project imaginable, and that is taking different shape than it did when my editor first contacted me, or we first kind of worked out the initial project. The original idea was that it was going to be a sort of multicultural redux of Russell's History of Western Philosophy or something like that, with a chapter on China and a chapter on India, but more of the same. I quickly convinced him that there's no need for that in this day and age. We have plenty of resources to learn the basic facts about who wrote what when. And what is far more interesting is sort of the metaphilosophical question, if you will, of the nature of philosophy and of the difficulty of first identifying, and then also subsequently comparing philosophical traditions. That is, what counts as a philosophical tradition? Is philosophy a proper noun denoting only that which descends from the Greek philosophia, or is it something that appears independently and separately in multiple places throughout the world? It seemed to me, and as I've tried to address in some of the pieces for The Stone that Patrick mentioned, that these are fundamental questions that need to be asked in an era in which almost everybody agrees that philosophy needs to diversify both demographically and to diversify in its canon. If we're going to diversify the canon, we need to ask what are the grounds for inclusion of a given text from a distant century and a distant intellectual tradition, and that leads us willy-nilly to the question, what is philosophy anyway, right? And so that's kind of the large background project that's motivating the present paper. In addition to that, there is the more specific occasion of the writing of at least a large portion of this paper, which is an invitation I received recently to contribute to a special issue of the Journal of Chinese Philosophy on Hegel and China. Now, I am neither a Hegel scholar nor a specialist in Chinese philosophy. My recent work is dealing mostly with Indian philosophy as a source of material for comparison and for the posing of methodological questions. However, I think, and I hope I can convince you, that the level of, or the sort of methodological and conceptual questions that I'm going to be looking at today are the sort that warrant this kind of distanced approach to the question without probing too deeply today into the history and the finer points of the Chinese intellectual tradition. So that's all by way of introduction. How much time do I have?
55 minutes.
Okay, great. So it is no secret that the academic discipline of philosophy, as conceived and structured in Europe, North America, and most of the rest of the world as well, is Eurocentric. Though many degree programs have a slot course for non-Western or Eastern philosophy, this very labeling reveals that Western functions as the unmarked category in a structuralist sense, as what is meant by default when we say philosophy. It's generally supposed that Western designates a continuous tradition descending from ancient Greece through Rome, medieval Western Europe, into the Renaissance and early modern period, moving principally into Germany from the end of the 18th century through most of the 19th century, and then ultimately finding its most recent headquarters in the transatlantic English language community of American academic institutions, universities, journals, conferences, and their European satellites. The several centuries of Arabic Islamic prevalence within this historical continuum, inserted seamlessly between Rome and scholasticism, are generally left out of these canned summaries. Whatever Islamic philosophy was then, it's often supposed, it cannot be Western now. This notwithstanding the fact that an American academic today would surely not see a resurrected Averroes as any more culturally other than a revived Pythagoras. It's generally supposed further, though almost never made explicit, that throughout this long history the participants in its various chapters conceived of what they were doing as Western. This is pure anachronism, of course, formed by the same faculty of the imagination that convinces people in other domains that Cro-Magnons were Europeans or that the Bible was written in English. It's true that we find a geographical distinction between Europe and Asia as early as the Hippocratic treatise, Airs, Waters, Places, of the 4th century BC. But a simple geographical distinction does not necessarily entail all or any of the same ideological or civilizational values that would later be associated with these place names. It's generally supposed, finally, I'm just sort of tallying for you a list of kind of received ideas about what Western philosophy is. It's generally supposed, finally, that all along Western philosophers have thought of their activity not just as Western, but as distinctively or exclusively Western. That is, as an activity that members of non-Western societies cannot fully engage in. This supposition, however, is largely a consequence of transformations within the disciplinary self-conception of philosophy that took place as recently as the 19th century. Hegel played an important role in these transformations and marks an important moment, as I would like to show. In this talk, I'd like to describe Hegel's role in making philosophy, in other words, Western philosophy by default, and also, in a preliminary stage, to offer a picture of an earlier conception of philosophy that the 19th century sought to overturn. So I'm going to begin with a brief discussion of the earlier idea that we find, for example, in Johann Jakob Brooker, a little-known character whom I'm going to resurrect for you today, showing in particular that such a designation was not typically intended as an oxymoron when people spoke of pagan philosophy or of similar terms, or as marking out an impossibility, but rather was simply meant to designate a real and non-controversial aspect of non-European societies. I'm going to then move on to Hegel's influential lectures on the history of philosophy, first given in 1825 and 26, and subsequently published in multiple editions, and I'll try to offer a reading of his preliminary analysis of Chinese and Indian thought, in the aim of understanding how he positions himself relative to earlier accounts of non-European philosophy, that is, accounts before Hegel. Finally, I'd like to consider the debates about philosophy that emerged in late 19th century China as a consequence of European attempts, such as that of Hegel, to circumscribe the geographical and civilizational scope of the discipline. How, in particular, may we see the emergence of a distinctly modern, generally nationalist discourse about Chinese philosophy within China as a reflection of a larger global process then taking place, and as a response to an emerging European ideological use of the idea of philosophy as a marker of Europe's own exceptionalism. So Johann Jakob Brooker's multi-volume work, published between 1742 and 1744, the Historia Critica Philosophiae, the critical history of philosophy, is noteworthy for a number of reasons. One reason that I won't go into today, but that was indicated in the title of this talk that has since changed a little bit, is that Brooker's work is the primary source for the article in the famous Encyclopédie of Diderot and others for the entry on the history of philosophy. So that's why I mentioned the Encyclopédie in the title of this talk, but what I'm going to do instead is go back to the original source, which is Brooker's 1740 critical history of philosophy. So it's noteworthy for a number of reasons, not least for its description of the study of the history of philosophy as an integral part of philosophy itself. And this is really one of the earliest attempts to make the history of philosophy a component of the discipline, right? Rather than simply treating the ancients, for example, as kind of a timeless trove of shared ideas to which we all have access. So it's an attempt, in other words, to historicize the discipline. So the history of philosophy, Brooker explains, is the history of human understanding, clearly showing the extent of its capacity, the causes of its perversion, and the means by which it may be recalled from its unprofitable wanderings, and successfully employed in subserviency to the happiness of mankind. Whilst it traces the origins and growth of useful knowledge, it also discovers the manner in which errors have arisen and been propagated, and exposes the injury which they have done to science, literature, and religion. It exhibits great and exalted minds as forsaking the path of truth and adopting opinions at once most absurd and most pernicious. This is why I like to study the history of philosophy, because it cuts the great minds down to size. A representation which cannot fail to show the folly of placing an implicit confidence in the judgment of celebrated men, or of admitting any system as true before it has undergone an accurate examination. Nor is there any concern for Brooker that this sort of anti-hagiographical scrutiny will, as he writes, produce a contempt of truly wise and learned men, since, quote, an acquaintance with the mistakes and failures of men who have unsuccessfully employed great ingenuity and industry in the pursuit of truth suggests a useful lesson of modesty and diffidence in our own inquiries. Significantly, Brooker's work is the first comprehensive modern survey of the history of philosophy, and does not suppose at the outset that philosophy is the exclusive property of members of a particular tradition. Rather, philosophy is something that can belong to any culture at all, and each culture needs to be investigated separately in order to determine whether it has philosophy or does not. Brooker acknowledges that it has long been a subject of dispute whether philosophy first appeared among the barbarians or among the Greeks. He concedes that the Greeks were singular in having, quote, learned an artificial method of philosophizing, but also insists that their philosophical vanity made them unwilling to allow that philosophy had any existence in other countries, except where it had been borrowed from them. So that would be sort of the proper noun definition of philosophy, where philosophy simply is philosophia, and then for that reason we can say that the Arabs have philosophy because they have falsafa, but you couldn't say that the Indians have philosophy because there's no line of descent, there's no history of transmission, right? And here we have Brooker trying to spell out the different possible interpretations of what philosophy is in 1740. Brooker believes, reasonably, that the controversy could be easily settled if we simply settled ourselves on a clear and appropriate definition of philosophy. And for him, the only such is a definition that acknowledges the importance of the progress made through the development of artificial methods, but that still does not withhold the label of philosophy from the activity of simple reflection that remains unformalized and even, in some cases, unwritten, so oral tradition. In this question, Brooker complains, as it frequently happens in controversy, from a want of distinct ideas and an accurate use of terms, many things foreign to the argument are advanced. He continues, if the meaning of the term philosophy had been correctly settled, if the infant state of knowledge had been distinguished from its more advanced age, and especially if due attention had been paid to the essential difference between communicating doctrines by mere authority and investigating the principles, relations, and causes of things by diligent study, the whole dispute would soon have found to be nothing more than a logomachy, a battle of words. This is my last long quote. I'm sorry it goes on for so long. For no one would assert that the barbaric nations were wholly inattentive to wisdom, or strangers to every kind of knowledge, human or divine. On the other side, it cannot be questioned that they became possessed of knowledge rather by simple reflection than by scientific investigation, and that they transmitted it to posterity rather by tradition than by demonstration. Whereas the Greeks, as soon as they began to be civilized, discovered a general propensity to inquiry and made use of scientific rules and methods of reasoning. Hence, it is easy to perceive that through the improvement of philosophy, though the improvement of philosophy is to be ascribed to the Greeks, its origin is to be sought for among the barbaric nations. What does he mean by barbaric nations? In a longer version of this text, I go into some detail. He, of course, cites the classic cases from Near Eastern antiquity, the Mesopotamians, or the favored term in the 18th century, the Chaldeans. He also describes what he calls Celtic philosophy, Scythian philosophy, and even Native American philosophy. And he, again, puts all of these on the side of simple reflection as opposed to artificial methods. Brooker's stark characterization of the novelty of the Greek approach to philosophical inquiry anticipates Hegel's in significant ways. And yet it's remarkable that in many respects his definition of philosophy as including both methodical inquiry and simple reflection is rather more capacious than most implicit definitions that have dominated the practice of academic philosophy for roughly the past 200 years. Brooker holds open the possibility of a common ground between ethnography, or what we would call ethnography, and philosophy, or between the study of the variety of human cultures and their belief systems on the one hand, and the study of the cultural practice of philosophy as descended from the Greeks on the other. In this, Brooker shares a similar spirit with many near contemporaries, particularly the philosophically inclined Catholic missionaries, and particularly the Jesuits in the extra-European sphere, who increasingly were coming to see the people they encountered through the romantic lens of an imagined European past. And thus we have cases like Lafitau on the Hurons in New France, who is just loading on the classical references to Tacitus in the Germanic world and to the Picts and so on. This becomes a very common trope of 18th century ethnography. Brooker is far more prepared to esteem the philosophy of the ancient barbarians, who have been more or less erased from the landscape of the contemporary world, than to see in a positive light those Asian traditions of thought that remained in the 18th century quite vital. He notes that the inhabitants of Asia are, in general, with respect to religion, either Mohammedans or pagans. Throughout most of India, he says, the grossest superstition and ignorance prevail, and most particularly the emanative system, which supposes innumerable divine natures proceeding from the fountain of deity and presiding over different parts of the universe. Brooker distinguishes this tradition from the Buddhism that emerges out of it, first in India itself, and then goes on to, quote, fascinate the whole northern and eastern regions of Asia, as well as part of the southern. Within China, he argues, Buddhism confronts native traditions, most notably those surrounding the text of the I Ching, attributed at the time to Fuxi. Brooker claims that no one has yet given a satisfactory explanation of its contents, but that Leibniz offered, quote, the most probable conjecture with his view that it was, quote, intended to teach the art of numeration. And of course, Leibniz was wrong. Leibniz interpreted the hexagrams of the I Ching as a sort of mathematical textbook, and he entirely missed the divinatory aspects of it. Brooker distinguishes this tradition in turn from Confucianism, which concerns itself principally with, quote, morals, the art of reasoning, and the principles of policy. Brooker is far less impressed by either the metaphysical or the ethical aspects of Chinese thought than Leibniz had been. And unfortunately, I can't talk about Leibniz today, but perhaps we'll be able to in the discussion. He complains of the obscurity of the ancient Chinese books and of the dubious credit of the reports brought to Europe by the Jesuit missionaries. Most uncertain is the status of the notion of deity. Some assert that their Zhengti, he writes, signifies a supreme creator of the world. Others ascribe to the Chinese system of nature describe the Chinese system of nature as nearly approaching atheism, whilst others maintain their doctrine to be that there is in the visible heavens a living and powerful nature, like the soul in the body, who has produced other secondary divinities, the rulers of the world, through whom the supreme deity is to be worshipped. He attributes to Leibniz the view, in turn, that the Li of the Chinese is the chaotic soul of the world, and that their Tai Qi, the soul of the formed world. In sum, the deity of the Stoics. So again, this constant attempt to assimilate new traditions to ancient ones. About Confucianism, he has very little to say, and his brevity seems to border on dismissiveness. The moral and political philosophy of the Chinese, he writes, as derived from Confucius, consists of detached maxims and precepts for the conduct of life. Brooker is not much interested in the way in which cultural practices, like medicine, for example, or astronomy, might constitute, in whole or in part, what counts as philosophy within a given culture. For Brooker, philosophy is a relatively pure element, extractable from the ore of culture, so to speak, and definable in terms of the explicit content of the arguments and concepts involved. A different standard is employed, to some extent, for ancient cultures such as the Celts or the Scythians, for whom philosophy was inevitably wrapped up in cultural practices. But these practices are more or less exhausted by the religious and ritual dimension of life, and do not extend to what we think of as science, and as, or of what elsewhere might be called natural philosophy. So already in Brooker, then, philosophy is emerging from the conception of it that had dominated in the 17th century, which included natural philosophy, i.e. science. In Brooker, it's emerging as a pure and well-bounded discipline in Europe, at least in its own self-conception. And one of the most serious consequences of this emergence is that it will make it increasingly difficult for Europeans to recognize non-European intellectual traditions which are integrated with cultural beliefs and practices in unfamiliar ways as philosophy. That is, if they look at a Sanskrit text that is speculating on the question of the intelligence of the celestial bodies, but is also doing so within the context of practical astronomy, it will become more and more difficult to recognize that there's philosophical reflection going on here, because increasingly astronomy is seen as an autonomous domain of inquiry. This new tendency will become particularly clear in Hegel's version of the global history of philosophy. Hegel cites Brooker's work in the introduction to his own lectures on the history of philosophy, calling it ein großer Ballast, either a great discharge or perhaps a great encumbrance. He accuses Brooker of failing to draw his conclusions from the sources themselves, and of instead mixing in reflections in keeping with the fashions of the day. For Hegel, modern European society is rooted, with respect to religion, in a place, as he obliquely puts it, from somewhere a bit to the east of Greece. As far as the life to come is concerned, Europe takes its lead from a, quote, far-off land, from a point somewhat further off than Greece, which he identifies as Syria. But as for the here, the present, by which Hegel means art and science, that which in giving liberty to our spiritual life gives it dignity, this comes from nowhere else, Hegel thinks, but Greece. Implicit here is the idea that other forms of spirituality, untempered by the liberty provided by the exercise of reason in philosophy, lack dignity. Hegel does not speak, as other Europeans would, later would, of a Greek miracle, the question so nicely adjudicated by Walter Burkhardt in a number of his works. But he does consistently describe the flourishing of reason and liberty in classical Greece as a sui generis phenomenon, which sprang up spontaneously in that place, without significant outside influence. The Greeks, he thinks, have themselves created the substantial in their culture and made their existence their own. That's a quote. It is precisely by means of philosophy that one can appropriate existence, rather than simply being subjected to or carried along by it. Hegel acknowledges that the Greeks have the, quote, substantial beginnings of religion and culture in, quote, Asia, Syria, and Egypt. But these are, these are elements that they have been able to, for the most part, leave behind. So again, implicit here is the idea that philosophy is not part of culture or an outgrowth of culture, but rather a rupture with it or a liberation from it, which again is very different from the European conception of philosophy through the end of the 17th century. Hegel's account of the spontaneous generation of Greek philosophy, so to speak, occurs in the first part of the lectures on the history of philosophy. Yet this first part does not come at the true beginning of the work. The very first subject addressed in Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy is Oriental philosophy. But for him, the subject is necessarily introductory. It does not, he writes, enter into the body and the domain of our exposition. It is only a precedent about which we speak only to give an account of why we will not concern ourselves with it at greater length, and in what relationship it stands to thinking, to the true philosophy. End of the quote. So recall that what is distinctive about Greek culture for Hegel is that spirituality is tempered by the freedom philosophy affords. In Asian traditions, by contrast, what there is of philosophy, he thinks, is entirely mixed with the spiritual, which means at the same time, interestingly, that for Hegel, Asian spirituality is more philosophical than Greek or later European religion. What we call Oriental philosophy, he writes, is much more the religious manner of representation of the Orientals, a religious worldview which it makes more sense to take as philosophy, end of quote. So Oriental philosophy for Hegel is religious philosophy, and the reason must be given as to why it is easier to treat the Oriental religious imagination as philosophy. Since the spiritual life of Asian cultures is untempered by a distinct tradition of philosophical liberty, it is, for Hegel, as we've established, undignified. Even if there is a philosophical component to Asian spirituality, the very fact that this component is thoroughly mixed with religious tradition means for Hegel that it can offer no degree of liberty, no measure of dignity in submission to religious belief and ritual. So the admixture does not so much preserve philosophy like a mineral in an ore, or like an element in an ore. Rather, it dissolves philosophy like water dissolves sugar. And this is a metaphor I return to over and over again in the text, is philosophy in the ore of culture, as opposed to Hegel's concern about culture as a sort of water that, or solvent that dissolves philosophy. On his view, Asian philosophy is dissolved into culture, whereas in the Greek tradition it has been thoroughly extracted. So the philosophical solution, so to speak, of Asian religion brings it about that there is a stronger inclination to philosophy. Do you want to fix that? Just bring it back up. Brings it about that there's a stronger inclination to philosophy in them than in Europe. In the Roman, Greek, and Christian religions, Hegel explains, we think less about philosophy. These religions are less suited to it. For Hegel, the key difference between the two types of worldview is rooted in the lack of a strong conception in Asia of individuality, in contrast with a very pronounced one in Europe. Where there is a lack of such individuality and such agency, he thinks, the conception of self required for philosophy cannot remain firm. Hegel gives as an example the contrast between the Greek and the Persian gods of time, showing that the Greek ones, conceptualized as individuals, leave no room for philosophical speculation, while the Persian ones rather symbolize unresolved philosophical problems and therefore invite a sort of philosophical speculation within the boundaries permitted by religion. And I think this is a really fascinating text. Individuality, Hegel writes, as long as there is a lack of freedom, is not firm. And where the general representations are also individually constructed, it is still only superficial form. This is the main reason why Oriental representations appear to us at once as philosophical thoughts. As we hear from the Greeks of an uranos, chronos, time, but already also individualized, we find among the Persians Zurvan Akurana, but this is unbounded time. We find Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu as the general sages, as representations. They appear as general principles, which thus seem to have a kinship with philosophy, or appear themselves as philosophers. So Hegel does not want to say, first and foremost, that Oriental philosophy is vitiated by religion. Rather, he wants to say that Asian religion is relatively more philosophical than that of the Greeks, Romans, Jews, and Christians, precisely because Asian civilization, lacking freedom, therefore also lacks individuality, and therefore, in turn, the gods of Asian religions do not represent individual persons so much as they offer a host of symbols, images, and aide-mémoire by which one may enter into a form of philosophical speculation, however constrained it may be by ritualistic or mythological expectations. So Hegel's Orient is large. It includes all the Near Eastern civilizations with which Greece was in contact, not least the peoples of Persia, Egypt, and the Levant, and notably among these latter, the Jews who bequeathed their religious legacy to Europe. It includes all of South Asia, and it includes China. Curiously, after some long general remarks about Oriental philosophy in the introduction, which include extensive consideration of its Semitic and Persian expressions, Hegel goes on to consider only two Oriental nations as subjects of explicit attention, the Chinese and the Indian. There is no acknowledgement that the indigenous traditions of these regions differ from the other Oriental traditions considered, those represented metonymically by the triad Babylon, Memphis, Persepolis. And that's the title of this well-known book by Walter Burkert, to which I just referred, to the extent that the former have virtually no significant interaction or shared developmental story with Greece. For Hegel, whether a tradition develops right next to Greece, in Egypt, say, even influencing the Greek tradition to the extent that a figure such as Plato would acknowledge Egypt as the source of all wisdom, or whether rather a tradition like that of China develops entirely independently of anything occurring in Greece, makes no difference. For him, the Orient is a fixed and eternal, discretely bounded zone, and its thought patterns are substantially unconnected to those of Greece, even if some Oriental societies have insubstantially influenced aspects of Greek culture and religious life. Hegel correctly identifies most of the astika, or orthodox darshanas, or doctrines, schools of Indian philosophy. These are traditionally considered orthodox to the extent that they recognize the supreme authority of the Vedas and conceptualize the task of philosophy as elaborating or clarifying what is already contained in the Shruti, or revealed texts. But Hegel also identifies the Nastika, or non-orthodox traditions, such as Charvaka or the atheistic strains of Buddhism, as similarly dependent on revelation. The Vedas, he writes, are the foundations of the philosophies of the Indians, even for the atheist. The Vedas, he writes, are the foundation of the philosophies of the Indians, even for the atheistic philosophies. These as well are not lacking in gods, he says. The reasoning here seems roughly comparable to what we hear in recent arguments that, for example, Richard Dawkins may be an atheist, but of a distinctly Anglican variety. And of course, Hegel could have made similar judgments of, say, the materialist atheism of a Diderot, for example. But he did not. It is only Oriental philosophy that remains of necessity for him, bound to religious tradition. Hegel acknowledges impressive feats of abstraction in Indian philosophy while arguing that its principal defect is to have as its highest aim, quote, the soul's drawing itself within itself. Such becoming explicit of the soul qualifies as a form of intellectual substantiality for Hegel. But what is missing here is the true objective ground of thought in the idea, in Hegel's terms. He's far less willing to extend laurels to the various traditions of Chinese philosophy, of which he identifies three: Confucianism, the philosophy of the I Ching, and Taoism. He describes the first of these as only a tradition of, quote, popular morality, and not an exceptional one at that. We find this everywhere, in every nation, he writes, and better. Hegel explicitly acknowledges that in Leibniz's time, everyone refers to Leibniz as the great defender and promoter of Chinese philosophy. This continues well into the 19th century. Hegel explicitly acknowledges that in Leibniz's time, the philosophy of Confucius made quite a sensation, thus consciously seeking not only to disavow any relevance of Confucian moral teaching for philosophy, but also to distance himself, and thus to distance philosophy itself, from the period of European philosophy, Leibniz's period, in which there could have been any perception of such relevance. So again, it's a narrowing of philosophy from the 17th to the 19th centuries in Europe. Hegel acknowledges that the Chinese also occupied themselves with abstract thoughts, with pure categories. He cites the I Ching as the principal example of this tendency, whose title he translates as Book of Principles, and whose authorship, he says, is traditionally traced back to Fu Xi. According to Hegel, the yin and yang, or the broken and solid lines that compose the hexagrams of the I Ching, are indeed abstract categories, but at the same time are, quote, the most superficial determinations of the understanding. This judgment is drawn from the fact that, as Hegel understands it, the lines serve as the basis of both Chinese philosophy as well as of the supposedly ideographic, but more properly logographic, writing system of the Chinese. There is thus no speculative engagement with the concrete in Hegel's sense. Rather, it is simply taken from ordinary ideas inasmuch as it is expressed in accordance with their forms of representation and of perception. And I could go on and on about this, about the history of interpretations of the Chinese writing system in Europe in the 17th century, in particular in Kircher, the German Jesuit, and Leibniz. The logographic element was seen as a perfection of writing. How wonderful it is to be able to represent the world in writing by actually reproducing the world rather than through arbitrary symbols. This was considered an achievement in the 17th century, whereas in the 19th century it's considered a primitive stage of the development of writing. The prejudice about philosophy here, leaving language aside, or written language, seems to reflect a parallel prejudice about the developmental stages of literacy, which holds that ideographic writing is a less advanced form than alphabetic writing, and notably that it is less suited for the expression of abstract thought. This perception of the symbols of the I Ching, then, is considerably far from that of both Leibniz and Brooker, whereas Brooker cites Leibniz as an authority on the topic, Hegel does not, who both held, that is Leibniz and Brooker, that the principal function of the hexagrams was not to express ideas drawn from the natural world or from natural language, but rather as an auxiliary to the study of mathematics. Finally, Hegel identifies Taoism as a third sect, which is, socially speaking, very distinct from the Mandarin class that values and transmits the teachings of Confucius. He identifies their central concern as the study of the laws of reason. Like the Stoics, the Taoists, on Hegel's view, believe that from right use of reason flow all virtues. In the end, Hegel believes that what reason uncovers for the Taoists is a sort of apophatic theology, where the ultimate ground of reality turns out to be unnameable, unknowable, and thus conceptually empty. In the end, Taoism, unlike Confucianism and the philosophy of the I Ching, is entirely unanchored for Hegel in concrete reality. But its brand of pure speculation yields nothing. There's no positive content to its most ambitious extensions of thought. Taoism for Hegel may perhaps be seen as a sort of inverse of what he takes Indian philosophy to be. The Indians strive to draw the soul into itself and lose all connection to the absolute. Taoism, by contrast, remains entirely focused on the absolute, to the detriment of any interest in the progress of philosophical psychology. Like the other systems of Chinese philosophy, and like all of Indian philosophy, moreover, for Hegel, the pure speculation of Taoism involves no awareness of the free individual engaged in the speculation, and thus remains entirely subordinate to religion. But this last point should not come as a surprise. It is an a priori conviction on Hegel's part that Oriental philosophy only ever appears, again, in solution, with religion as the fluid in which it is dissolved. For Hegel, and for most academic philosophers working after Hegel in Europe, whether in a tradition indebted to him or in a tradition that decisively rejects him, the conclusion is by and large the same. Non-Western philosophy is only philosophy in a secondary, derivative, or otherwise scare-quoted sense. What now is the significance of these internal developments within European philosophy for the intellectual traditions in the regions of the world from which the label of true philosophy was, over the course of the 19th century, increasingly being withheld? Is the situation analogous to the well-known relationship between ornithologists and birds, where the party being described evidently has little interest in the description being offered of it? In fact, while outside characterizations in earlier eras, indeed even as recently as the time of Leibniz, could easily have had no impact within China, in the era of high imperialism, of opium wars, of the increasing hegemonic status of European goods and practices throughout the world, it was inevitable that the European denial of Chinese philosophy would not go unheard in China. And this is ironic, since in earlier eras of greater autonomy from one cultural region to the next, there could have been little perceived reason in China to wish to have something called philosophy at all. To put this somewhat differently, the existence of Chinese philosophy had to be denied before anyone would consider it worth affirming. At issue was not tradition, but modernity. For Hegel, philosophy is as far from the prisca theologia as possible. That is, the idea that all wisdom traditions can be traced back to the same source in, so to speak, deep time. It is not something that is passed down through the wisdom of the ancients, even if it does have, for him, a distinct point of origin in the ancient world. Following its appearance, it becomes successively clearer and more explicit, more sharply bound off from the elements of culture into which, in its archaic and Oriental expressions, it remains dissolved. In China, what we see in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is a concerted effort to carve out, indeed to extract from the bed of culture, an activity that could be called philosophy, and that Westerners would be prepared to recognize as such. Thus, Jeremy Tanner explains, and Jeremy Tanner is one of the people involved in a work group on the methodology of comparison of intellectual traditions we have going at the University of Paris VII right now. He's an art historian who works principally on Greek and Chinese antiquity, and we're also joined by Jeffrey Lloyd, who works on classical Greek and classical Chinese medicine. So the project is an interdisciplinary approach to the problem of comparison in art, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, so on. Philosophy presents some special problems of its own, but it's still in there. So Tanner writes, the canonical texts of the traditional masters, Confucius, Mencius, and so on, only came to be classified as philosophy, zheshui, a borrowed 19th century Japanese neologism, in the early 20th century. In the context of the opening to the West in early Republican China, thinkers like Feng Yulan sought to both modernize traditional Chinese thought and to show that Chinese tradition could contribute to the project of philosophy as a universal patrimony. This entailed a massive transformation in the institutional transmission of Chinese thought. Traditional teachings handed down in jia, lineages, by scholar officials, for whom painting, calligraphy, poetry were all part of an integral literati culture alongside the canons, became academic philosophy taught in university departments on the Western model. So in other words, if you want philosophy, among the transformations you have to undertake is the expulsion of, for example, calligraphy from what had previously been a unified intellectual project. Thus, calligraphy and poetry get abruptly reclassified, removed from their traditional embedding within a distinctive schema of the domains of human practice and inquiry in order to better fit the Western model. Tanner is certainly accurate in this description, but he omits to note that in Europe itself, a similar restructuring had occurred only recently as well. A few centuries before Hegel, domains of practical inquiry, such as astronomical navigation or the production of chemical reactions, were also considered part of philosophy, indeed likely more so than were proofs of the existence of God. So arguably, it is not that China was adapting to a timeless Western schema of the division of human knowledge, with philosophy as a pristine activity set apart from and above the others. Rather, a recent revolution in European philosophy was spreading, after only a few centuries, from its place of origin. Now, it's crucial to note that the relationship between history and philosophy and the way different national traditions are assessed following Hegel for their philosophical character. As is well known, one significant feature of Hegel's contribution to European philosophy is his account of philosophy as a dynamic activity, unfolding in time, with the result that it would become impossible for those working in the broadly Hegelian tradition to think of their own place in philosophy as simply an eternal dialogue with all who have come before them. But with philosophy so historicized, China faces a double obstacle, since a parallel and related prejudice of 19th century Europe had been that China is more or less static, without history. to use Eric Wolf's term. As Heiner Roetz explains, China's having no history became identical with its having no philosophy. The main protagonist of this turn is Hegel. But if China once appeared to Europeans to have stood outside of history, it was clear enough that over the course of the 19th century, the country entered into it with a bang. The Opium Wars in particular represented a forceful and explicit integration of the Chinese economy into the global European-dominated economy, and a consequent restructuring of its institutions and priorities so as to suit the exigencies of that economy. And it is with this abrupt entry into global history that an activity explicitly conceptualized as philosophy is for the first time produced. Many scholars have emphasized that the very transformations that made it possible to conceptualize Chinese thought in terms of the history of Chinese philosophy were the same transformations that effectively made it impossible for this history to continue as a living tradition. Thus, Joël Torreval observes that, quote, the introduction of a modern disciplinary institution such as academic philosophy has meant simultaneously the destruction of the conditions of possibility of Neo-Confucian practice. Karine Defort, similarly, notes that it was toward the end of the 19th century that the part of the corpus long attributed to the masters, extending back to the 5th century BC, was retroactively christened Chinese philosophy. Again, the neologism je suis. Defort notes that the irony that, quote, at the moment when Chinese philosophy was retrospectively recognized or created as a subject for university study, it thus practically ceased to exist as a living tradition. On Torreval's even starker account, Chinese philosophy is something that can only be conceptualized in a post-mortem fashion. To the extent that it is being thought, it is already being thought of as something past. And the institutions that spring up to study it in its pastness are fundamentally different from those that had been capable of sustaining it as a living tradition. The most basic difference between the two phases, Torreval argues, is that as a living tradition, Chinese thought presupposes no distinction between theory and practice. What was said in Chinese tradition was just as much the product of lived practices as it was the cause of them. The newer Chinese philosophy rejects the traditional identity of intellect and conduct and instead, quote, presupposes a Western modern conception of practice as simply application of a pre-given theory. Ultimately, the reasons behind the split between intellect and conduct are, again, institutional. While it is difficult to see how living tradition could be submitted to such a treatment, the principal theoretical commitments that play a role in such a tradition may be schematized, and standardization through textbooks, professionalized pedagogy, top-down establishment of benchmarks and desired outcomes. In short, the features of the European bureaucratic university that by the end of the 19th century had come to be associated with progress. When the Japanese scholar Nishi Amane coins the new Chinese term, je suis, on the model of the Japanese Tetsugaku, he is consciously seeking to provide Chinese students who have come to Japan to study with him a term that will set China on equal footing with Japan and with Europe with respect to recognition of the venerable character of its intellectual tradition. But in the new politics of recognition, as Amane understood, in order to have philosophy, a nation must be willing to lose whatever tradition it was that the new philosophy looks back on historically. In order to study the skeleton, one must first kill the living beast. I'm trying to skip a bit because I want to conclude in due time, and I only have a few minutes. But I'm just going to try to get through the whole thing, and I apologize if I go 3 minutes over. Torreval pointedly observes that the oft-asked question, is there a Chinese philosophy, should be recognized for what it is, a question that only has meaning for a philosopher. The historian, by contrast, who investigates Chinese thought prior to the 20th century, can perfectly well do without it. It is only a philosopher today, and a fairly ahistorical and systematic philosopher at that, who could believe that philosophy denotes some fixed or eternal activity that a national tradition either instantiates or fails to instantiate. The historian, by contrast, knows that what gets called philosophy from one era to another has a great deal to do with politics and culture. This is the case even if we confine our study of history to the European sphere. There have, moreover, been other examples of the study of philosophy shifting from a vital and systematic program to a retrospective and historicizing program. Over the past few decades, for example, analytic philosophy as a positive program has been largely replaced by the study of the history of analytic philosophy, from, for example, Frege through Quine. But the Chinese case is of particular interest to the extent that it is only when the intellectual tradition takes on a backward-looking perspective and comes to think of itself as having undergone a rupture with its past that it comes to think of itself as philosophy at all. This reconceptualization is a result of a complex global process, not least the globalization of the aspiration to modernity. This aspiration has played a role in global history for a long time now, and it has been questioned and criticized for almost as long. But it is not clear that any satisfying answer has begun to emerge to the question how we might understand individual national intellectual traditions in relation to the present condition of a national culture, or how we might fruitfully compare these national traditions with one another, or, finally, how we might speak of them together in terms that do not favor one tradition or the other. So, quickly to conclude. In a well-known study of the reactions of different Pacific societies to the arrival of European capitalism, Marshall Sahlins notes that while the Sandwich Islanders and the Northwest Coast Native Americans incorporated blankets and other objects into their cultural practices in complicated and unexpected ways, China famously spent some centuries in apparently total indifference to the goods and machines Europe had to offer. Thus, Sahlins cites Le Père Cibot, who in 1782 complains that nous ne plierons jamais cette nation à nos goûts et à nos idées. So we'll never bend this nation to our tastes and to our ideas. Sahlins describes the remarkable collecting habits of emperors who would take handsome tribute in the form of state-of-the-art machines from European traders, but rather than using them, let alone requesting a shipment of more of the same, would simply put the specimens in their own personal palace display. The machines magnified the greatness of the emperor himself, became part of a microcosmic display of the reach of his own influence. Clearly not what the traders were after. Yet Cibot, writing in 1782, was overly pessimistic. It was not that the Chinese would never be plied, but only that this would take more aggressive and sustained measures. Again, not just gifts of astrolabes and giraffes, but also opium and tariffs. It is revealing also that while Cibot is a practical man concerned with commerce, he complains of Chinese resistance not to European goods, but to European tastes and ideas. This practical man may be more lucid about the connection than most philosophers have been, though Leibniz himself famously said that we already have a commerce of goods with China. What we need now is a commerce of light, which is the title of Franklin Perkins' wonderful book on Leibniz and China. What made philosophy at a certain moment in history such a precious resource for different national cultures to trade, so to speak, on the world market? It appears that Pace Leibniz, the separation between goods and light is not so sharp. Over the course of the 19th century, philosophy seems to have become a sort of status object, which societies could call upon to buttress their claim to being among the great nations of the modern world. Homegrown forms of it could then be imported and exported through translation, publication, insertion into university curricula around the world, and so on. It is at just this time that European thinkers began to take measures to protect what they would increasingly see as a monopoly. Philosophy will become something more like a brand name, so to speak, than a natural resource, as it had plainly been for Leibniz and Brooker. It is not like water or marble, but more like, say, eau de Cologne or Murano glass. The right to use the label philosophy comes to depend on the amount of extractive work that goes into separating philosophical thought from the natural environment of culture. Thus, the popular morality of Confucianism or the religious context of Vedic philosophy or Taoism cannot infringe on the monopoly, since they are not sufficiently removed from their natural setting and transformed into culture-independent artifacts through the labor of decontextualization and systematization. And thus did Hegel help to turn philosophy into an industrial product of sorts. The extent to which academic philosophy today continues to see Vedic cosmogonic speculation, the speculative divinatory practices of the I Ching, or the practical morality of Confucius as totally discontinuous with its own concerns is precisely the extent to which the 19th century's industrial monopolistic vision of philosophy continues to dominate. Thank you.